that in our society, we have all the helping professions, the guidance counselors, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, as well as our pop culture icons from California, out there pushing our poor young people into the idea that it's cool to be transgender. And the fact that recently it's come out, the number of kids who are transgender, and I think it is 18 or 19-year-olds, has been cut in half, which proves what anybody with common sense knew all along. There was a cool thing created so that young people could say, look at me, I'm transgender. And some of these kids, their life is ruined. It's a testament, by the way, that this is not genetic, when all you have to do is look at the fact that these kids have to continue to take powerful drugs even after surgery. If it was a natural thing, you wouldn't have to keep taking the drug.
So you just watched that, and you're sitting there right now feeling what I'm feeling, which is that particular cocktail of rage and despair that comes from watching a sitting member of Congress lie directly into a camera about vulnerable children, and you need to understand what just happened here, because this is not just another culture war skirmish. This is the front line of an existential battle for bodily autonomy and human dignity, and we are watching in real time as Glenn Grothman, the Wisconsin congressman with a decades-long history of targeting queer people, deploys every single weapon in the authoritarian playbook to justify state control over the most intimate medical decisions families can make. Just this week, literally days ago, the House passed Marjorie Taylor Greene's bill to throw parents and doctors who provide life-saving medical care to young trans people in prison for up to 10 years. The Trump administration announced rules that would essentially ban gender-affirming care for transgender young people by withholding all Medicare and Medicaid funding from hospitals that provide such care. And here we have Grothman spinning this fairy tale about guidance counselors, psychiatrists, and California celebrities somehow manufacturing an epidemic of transgender youth like it's some kind of coordinated conspiracy to make being trans cool, when what we're actually witnessing is the most comprehensive assault on healthcare access for a marginalized community in modern
American history. Let me break down the cascade of lies you just heard, because each one builds on the next in a structure designed to dehumanize and delegitimize the existence of transgender people. First, Grothman claims that helping professions and pop culture icons from California are pushing young people into identifying as transgender, which is a rhetorical move straight out of the 1950s Lavender Scare playbook, where LGBTQ identities were framed as contagious social diseases spread by corrupting influences. And this is important because Grothman has explicitly stated that the underlying reason for transgender sports bans is that if trans individuals are allowed to play sports, they might never switch back to their assigned sex at birth, revealing that the entire legislative agenda is not about protecting anyone, but about using state power to pressure transgender people back into the closet through systemic discrimination.
This is the same Glenn Grothman, who in 2006 warned that teaching about gay people in schools would promote a homosexual agenda, standard talking points from Wisconsin Republican leadership, and Grothman has long insisted that sexual orientation is a choice, not a matter of genetic, demonstrating a consistent ideological commitment to the belief that LGBTQ identities are manufactured rather than innate. Then comes the statistical sleight of hand, and you need to pay attention here because this is where Grothman tries to manufacture evidence for his social contagion theory, by citing the number of kids who are transgender, and I think it is 18 or 19-year-olds, has been cut in half as proof that being trans was just a cool thing that kids have now abandoned. Now here's what's actually happening with the data, and why this narrative is so dangerous. Recent reports have shown that among college students, those identifying as a gender other than male or female dropped from 6.8% in 2023 to 3.6% in 2025, with the share of trans-identified students effectively halving in just 2 years. And conservative commentators have seized on this as evidence that transgender identity was a social fad. But here's what they're not telling you, and what makes this interpretation not just wrong, but actively harmful. Other analyses suggest that conclusions of a freefall in transgender identification may be greatly exaggerated, with some data showing trans and non-binary identification at an all-time high as of spring 2025, with evidence of a plateau rather than a sharp decline, and cross-sex identification, especially among females who identify as trans men, appearing to still be on the rise, meaning the picture is far more complex than Grothman's reductive narrative allows. And even if we accept the premise that fewer young people are identifying as trans right now, researchers suggest social influences are an important factor in the rise and decline of trans, queer and bisexual identity among young people since the 2010s. But this is not the gotcha Grothman thinks it is, because social influence doesn't mean identities are fake. It means the social conditions that allow people to understand and articulate their authentic selves are shifting in response to the fact that care is already banned in 27 states with 40.1% or 120,400 trans youth aged 13 to 17 living in states that have passed bans. What Grothman is doing here is classic victim-blaming causality reversal, where he attributes declining identification rates to kids snapping out of a fad, when what's actually happening is that these legislative moves are designed to erase queer and trans people from public life, to shame, isolate, and endanger, and they've created a climate where physical violence, mental health crises, and suicidality are on the rise for trans youth. And we know from decades of research on minority stress that hostile social and political environments don't eliminate LGBTQ identities, they drive them underground at tremendous psychological cost. Recent analysis indicates the shift in queer and trans identification is not due to youth becoming less woke, more religious, or more conservative, because those beliefs remain stable throughout the 2020s, and researchers note that improving mental health is connected to this trend of declining Gen Z transgenderism, though only partially, with less anxious and especially depressed students linked with smaller shares identifying as trans, queer, or bisexual, which tells us something fascinating because if being trans were inherently a product of mental illness as conservatives claim, we would expect mental health improvements to have no effect on identification rates, but instead what we're seeing is that as the acute mental health crisis of the pandemic years recedes, some young people who may have been exploring identity during a period of intense psychological distress are settling into identities that feel more aligned for them, which is exactly how identity development is supposed to work, and has nothing to do with whether transgender people are real or deserve healthcare. And then Grothman drops this absolute whopper that some of these kids, their life is ruined, as if the ruination comes from transitioning, rather than from living in a society where a sitting congressman can advocate for criminalizing your healthcare, why doctors face up to 10 years in federal prison if they provide gender-affirming care to minors, including prescribing hormone replacement therapy to adolescents or puberty blockers to young kids, where families have to make drives of almost 7 hours from Atlanta to reach a gender clinic because nearly the entire South has banned care, where families are leaving the United States entirely due to anti-trans policies. The projection here is staggering, because what actually ruins young trans lives is denial of care, family rejection, social stigma, and legislative persecution, not the care itself. Transition-related healthcare for transgender people and youth is supported by every major medical association and leading health authority, and efforts to ban and criminalize this care are not based in medical or scientific expertise. And there is strong consensus among the most prominent medical organizations worldwide that evidence-based, gender-affirming care for transgender children and adolescents is medically necessary and appropriate. We have decades of research showing that gender-affirming medical care has positive mental health impacts for transgender adolescents and young adults, with cross-sectional surveys of more than 20,000 transgender adults finding significantly lower odds of lifetime suicidal ideation in those treated with pubertal blockers during adolescence compared to those who wanted such treatment but didn't receive it. And research shows access to pubertal blockers during adolescence is associated with a significant decrease in suicidal ideation. But here's where Grothman's argument descends into pure biological essentialism, masquerading as common sense when he declares, "It's a testament, by the way, that this is not genetic, when all you have to do is look at the fact that these kids have to continue to take powerful drugs even after surgery. If it was a natural thing, you wouldn't have to keep taking the drugs." This is such a profoundly ignorant statement about human endocrinology that it would be laughable if it weren't being used to justify stripping healthcare from vulnerable children. By this logic, diabetics aren't really diabetic because if diabetes were natural, they wouldn't need to keep taking insulin. People with hypothyroidism aren't really sick because if it were a natural condition, they wouldn't need to keep taking thyroid hormone. Cisgender women who've had hysterectomies aren't really women because they need hormone replacement therapy to maintain their hormonal profiles. The entire argument rests on a fundamental misunderstanding, willful or otherwise, of how endocrine systems work. Transgender women who've had orchiectomies and transgender men who've had oophorectomies require ongoing hormone therapy for the same reason cisgender people who've had their gonads removed require ongoing hormone therapy because gonads are the body's primary source of sex hormones, and when you remove them, regardless of your gender identity, you need exogenous hormones to maintain health. Doctors have used puberty-blocking medications safely for decades for cisgender children who experience precocious puberty, but when the same medications are used for transgender youth, suddenly they become powerful drugs in Grothman's formulation, revealing that the objection is not to the medications themselves, but to the existence and self-determination of transgender people. What Grothman is really arguing here, without saying it explicitly, is that transgender identities are inherently invalid, that there is no such thing as a legitimate transgender person, that anyone who identifies as trans is either deluded or has been socially manipulated, and therefore the state has not just the right, but the obligation to intervene to prevent people from transitioning. This is eliminationist rhetoric dressed up in the language of child protection, and we need to be absolutely clear about what's at stake, because Congress just passed a bill introduced by Marjorie Taylor Greene that makes it a crime to provide gender-affirming care to transgender minors, punishable by a fine or prison time of up to 10 years, and another bill passed that would prohibit Medicaid reimbursement for gender-affirming care for youth. And while both bills would have to pass the Senate to become law, the Trump administration isn't waiting, because they've proposed rules that prohibit doctors and hospitals from receiving federal Medicaid reimbursement for gender-affirming care provided to transgender patients younger than age 18, and block all Medicaid and Medicare funding for any services at hospitals that provide pediatric gender-affirming care, because virtually every hospital in the country takes Medicare, and hospitals rely on Medicare funding. The rule would have a wide-ranging effect, making access to pediatric gender-affirming care across the country extremely difficult, if not impossible. Think about the audacity of what's happening here, because this represents an unprecedented use of the executive branch's power to control what medical care is available in hospitals, where the rule would essentially force hospitals to end their gender care programs for transgender youth, meaning all of those programs' patients, whether they have Medicaid or private insurance, would lose access. And the Trump administration is going even further because the federal suicide prevention lifeline specifically for transgender youth was canceled, as were hundreds of millions of dollars in scientific research funding related to LGBTQ health. Federal health officials warned state Medicaid directors to tread carefully, and the Department of Justice announced subpoenas of some children's hospitals and threatened providers with prosecution, creating what advocates describe as a significant chilling effect, where in states where care is still legal, many clinics and hospitals have ended their programs for gender-affirming care. The administration's efforts on transgender issues stretch far beyond health policy and beyond youth, with the FTC hosting workshops on gender-affirming care, the military forcing out transgender service members, universities told their federal funding is contingent on adopting anti-transgender policies on bathroom access, and even the impending lapse in funding for food assistance linked to Democratic support for gender mutilation procedures, according to a Department of Agriculture website banner, leading experts to characterize this as an endless and obsessive focus deployed across the administration. Now I want you to understand the human cost of what Grothman is advocating for, because there's a mother who spoke to NPR, and she asked not to be named because she fears losing her job or risking her family's safety by speaking about their experiences, and she described her process of learning about gender-affirming care for her teenager and concluding that the benefits outweighed the risks, and she says if we can't stop the government from legislating what healthcare families can receive in consultation with their doctors, then she doesn't recognize this America. Her son is 15 years old and has been taking testosterone for about 6 months. He is a scout, runs cross-country, wants to work in a math or science field. His friends know he is transgender, but not everyone at his high school does, and he emphasized that he came out to his parents, and it took them a long time to be okay with that. They went to a lot of therapy, had a lot of discussions. His parents were scared for him to start it. Both he and his parents researched it because it wasn't just a whim. This is what actual gender-affirming care looks like in practice. Thoughtful families working with medical professionals over extended periods, making careful individualized decisions, not the caricature of kids being rushed into irreversible procedures that Grothman and his allies paint. And when Grothman talks about California pop culture icons pushing kids into being trans, what he's really objecting to is visibility, the fact that transgender people exist in public life, that young people can see examples of transgender adults living full, meaningful lives, that there are narrative frameworks available beyond shame and secrecy for understanding gender diversity. This is the same moral panic that's been deployed against every expansion of LGBTQ rights for decades. The protect the children rhetoric that first was protect kids from gay teachers, then protect kids from gay parents, now protect kids from drag queens and trans healthcare. And the lie is the same one Grothman told in 2010, the same one Anita Bryant and Jerry Falwell used in the 1980s, and now it's coming from groups like Moms for Liberty, with deep funding and national backing, claiming to be grassroots while pushing censorship, book bans, and anti-trans policies. What's different now is the scope and coordination of the attack, Because almost 600 anti-LGBTQ bills have been introduced nationally so far during the 2025 legislative session, and the Supreme Court ruled in June 2025 in U.S. v. Scarametti to allow politicians' targeting of transgender youth's healthcare needs to stand, limiting constitutional challenges that could be raised if states pass bans on gender-affirming care for trans youth. The Supreme Court decision deserves particular attention because the court ruled that Tennessee's law banning gender-affirming care did not constitute sex-based discrimination and did not violate the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, with 25 bans remaining in place as a result, and this represents a catastrophic failure of constitutional protection for a vulnerable minority, where the court has essentially given states permission to legislate transgender people out of existence. The ruling in U.S. v. Scarametti upheld Tennessee's ban on affirming healthcare treatments for transgender youth, and by deciding that the law is constitutional, the Supreme Court has made it more difficult to challenge similar laws in the 27 other states where such laws are currently in effect, which means we cannot rely on the courts to protect us. We cannot wait for institutional mechanisms to recognize the humanity of transgender people. We need mass mobilization and direct action and sustained political pressure to resist this elimination its agenda. And here's what makes Grothman's invocation of common sense particularly insidious. Because common sense is always the refuge of reactionaries who want to avoid engaging with empirical evidence or moral philosophy. Common sense told people the earth was flat. Common sense told people different races shouldn't mix. Common sense has been wrong about virtually every major social transformation in human history. What Grothman calls common sense is actually just unexamined cisgender normativity, the assumption that everyone's gender identity matches their assigned sex at birth, and that anyone who deviates from this pattern is aberrant and requires correction. But the actual consensus among people who study gender development and transgender health is precisely the opposite. There is growing consensus among professional medical and psychological and psychiatric health organizations that collaborative, multidisciplinary gender-affirmative care is an effective approach, and this shift emphasizes that gender is an aspect of a person's identity, that being transgender or gender diverse is not inherently pathological and does not constitute a mental disorder, with the DSM-5 recognizing that not all gender-diverse people experience gender dysphoria, but among those who do, psychosocial or medical interventions to support gender affirmation may be considered. The care that Grothman wants to criminalize is not experimental or radical, it follows established protocols refined over decades. The World Professional Association for Transgender Health's 8th edition of its Standards of Care is 260 pages and was compiled by more than 3,000 members worldwide to provide scientific and medical professional consensus about best practices. Care for minors includes social transition for youth who have yet to go through puberty, including using correct pronouns, names, and titles, as well as allowing authentic gender expression, and puberty blockers can be prescribed as a child reaches puberty to pause unwanted physical effects of puberty incongruent with one's gender identity. The use of puberty-delaying medication or hormone therapy remains rare and reflects a cautious approach, with fewer than 1 in 1,000 U.S. adolescents with commercial insurance receiving either treatment during the 5-year period from 2018 to 2022, according to a Harvard study, and guidelines recommend against prescribing any medication for gender dysphoria before puberty starts, completely contradicting the narrative of doctors rushing children into irreversible interventions. What we're watching here is the construction of a medical emergency that doesn't exist to justify state intervention into private medical decisions, and the real emergency is the one being created by people like Grothman. Access to gender-affirming care has been linked to lower rates of depression and suicidality for young trans and non-binary people, as well as for trans adults, with counselors regularly hearing from trans and non-binary youth who express fear and anxiety and deep concern over anti-transgender politics they're hearing about in the news, and so many young people have expressed that this care made their lives better and allowed them to lead healthy, happy, successful lives. The Trevor Project research shows that nearly half of transgender and non-binary young people seriously consider suicide, and access to affirming care significantly lowers mental health risks, which means every time a state passes a ban, every time a hospital shuts down a gender clinic under federal pressure, every time a family is forced to flee their home state to access care, we are creating conditions that will directly lead to increased suffering and death among transgender youth. And we need to talk about who's actually being protected here, because it's certainly not children. The legislation criminalizing care for transgender youth explicitly endorses non-consensual surgical procedures on intersex youth and infants, revealing that this has never been about protecting children from medical interventions they can't consent to. It's specifically about preventing transgender children from accessing care that might allow them to live authentically. The hypocrisy is so blatant it's almost comical, except that real families are being destroyed by these policies. A mother of a trans 15-year-old said Congress has to reject these bills because they are so dangerous and insulting to families like hers, and her family recently left the United States due to anti-trans policies. With parents trying to stay one step ahead, finding it really difficult to relocate. These are American citizens being forced into exile, families being torn apart, children being denied medically necessary care, and for what? So Glenn Grothman can score political points with a base that's been taught to see transgender people as existential threats, rather than as vulnerable human beings, seeking basic dignity and healthcare. The language about kids being pushed into transition reveals a fundamental condescension toward young people's capacity for self-knowledge and agency. When a child persistently and consistently articulates a gender identity different from their assigned sex, when families and medical providers work together over months or years to understand that child's needs, when careful protocols are followed to ensure the child has the support and information necessary to make informed decisions about their care, Grothman sees manipulation rather than empowerment. All medical interventions for any child under age 18 require parental consent as well as the child's assent. It is recommended that adolescents and their parents be involved in psychological care to help them understand the benefits, risks, and permanent effects of gender-affirming interventions. Youth undergoing medical interventions are carefully monitored by specialized endocrinologists to ensure their safety and well-being, and when possible, adolescents are provided with options for fertility preservation, demonstrating that the care is provided with extensive safeguards and family involvement that Grothman's narrative completely erases. What Grothman and his allies are really fighting is the expansion of freedom, the radical notion that individuals should have sovereignty over their own bodies and identities, that gender diversity is part of human variation rather than a disorder to be corrected, that young people can be trusted in consultation with their families and medical providers to make decisions about their own health care. Some national Democrats have gone quiet on trans rights, avoiding the conversation, worried about swing voters or independent moderates, but rights that politicians only defend when it's convenient are not rights at all, and the truth is cultural acceptance has always been what drives policy change, not the moral courage of politicians, with public support shifting first and politicians following. Which means our work cannot be to wait for Democratic politicians to grow spines, but to build the cultural and political power necessary to force protection of transgender rights, regardless of which party holds power. This is why the framing of transgender healthcare as a partisan political issue is so dangerous, because healthcare shouldn't be political. The right to live authentically shouldn't be political. Basic human dignity shouldn't be political. But Republicans have made it political because they need an enemy. They need an other to mobilize their base against. And transgender people, especially transgender youth, are vulnerable and visible and make convenient targets. Representative Sarah McBride rebuked Republicans for advancing anti-trans bills while letting Affordable Care Act tax credits expire, which is expected to raise healthcare costs for millions of Americans, saying they would rather have us focus on and debate a misunderstood and vulnerable 1% of the population, instead of focusing on the fact that they are raiding everyone's healthcare, and that they are obsessed with trans people, which gets at the fundamental bad faith of this entire project, because if Republicans actually cared about children's welfare, they would be fighting for universal healthcare, for fully funded public schools, for robust social services, for gun control to stop the leading cause of death among American children, but instead they're spending their political capital criminalizing healthcare for transgender youth because cruelty and control have always been the point. The data Grothman cites about declining identification rates, even if we take it at face value, tells us nothing about whether those who identify as trans are really trans or deserve care. It just tells us that social conditions affect people's willingness and ability to articulate marginalized identities, which is something we've known since forever. Gay and lesbian identification didn't suddenly surge after Stonewall because homosexuality was invented in 1969. It surged because people finally had language and community, and some minimal degree of safety to articulate identities that had always existed but had been forced underground by violence and stigma. Trans identification increased in the 2010s and 2020s for similar reasons: increased visibility, more affirming environments, better access to information and community, and if it's declining now, it's declining because 40.1%, or 120,400 trans youth, aged 13 to 17, are living in the 27 states that have passed bans on gender-affirming care, because the entire apparatus of state power is being deployed to terrorize transgender people back into the closet, because families are literally fleeing the country to protect their children. That's not evidence that trans identity was a fad. It's evidence that authoritarian persecution works to suppress visible expression of marginalized identities, which should horrify us, not vindicate us. The stakes here extend far beyond transgender healthcare, because what we're witnessing is a test case for how far the government can go in controlling bodily autonomy and private medical decisions. If the state can criminalize gender-affirming care for transgender youth over the objections of major medical associations, if the federal government can use Medicare and Medicaid funding as a cudgel to force hospitals to deny care to transgender patients, if parents can be investigated for child abuse for supporting their transgender children, then no healthcare decision is safe from political interference. The same logic that says the government knows better than families and doctors about transgender healthcare can be and is being applied to abortion care, to contraception, to fertility treatments, to any medical intervention that conservative politicians find ideologically objectionable. The proposed measures represent an unprecedented federal intrusion into the private medical decisions of families and their doctors, and the administration is weaponizing the federal government to target a vulnerable population for political gain, because healthcare decisions belong to families and their doctors, not politicians. When if we allow this precedent to stand, we are opening the door to totalitarian control over the most intimate aspects of human life. So what do we do with all this? Because I know right now you're probably feeling overwhelmed and hopeless, and wondering if there's any point in fighting when the courts have failed us, and Congress is passing criminalization bills, and the administration is using every lever of executive power to eliminate transgender healthcare. But here's what I need you to understand. The ACLU has promised that if the administration moves forward with attempts to enact a national ban on medical care through coercion, they will see them in court and will not rest until the rights of transgender youth to live authentically and access the care they need are fully protected. And attorneys general in New York and California have said they will fight these rules and protect the rights of trans people to get care in their states, and the ACLU has vowed to sue with more legal challenges expected. And while legal challenges are necessary, they're not sufficient because we also need mass mobilization. We need sustained direct action. We need to make the political cost of attacking transgender people higher than the political benefit Republicans think they're getting. We need to support the organizations doing this work, contribute to trans mutual aid funds, show up to school board meetings to fight book bans and bathroom bills, pressure Democratic politicians to stop running away from trans rights and start fighting for them with the same energy Republicans bring to attacking them, create affirming spaces in our communities for transgender and gender-diverse young people, believe trans people when they tell us who they are and what they need, and fundamentally refuse to accept the premise that transgender existence is up for debate or that anyone's humanity should be subject to popular vote or legislative whim. We need to seek quotes and background from transgender people in any story about transgender people or youth, because their lived experience is valuable to help readers and viewers understand trans people exist, live full and healthy lives, and receive healthcare that is safe and life-saving. And we need to accurately report the widely held consensus about the safety and efficacy of transgender healthcare, avoid elevating singular voices or rare cases in equal weight to the consensus and preponderance of evidence, challenge people making negative claims about transgender healthcare to provide facts and evidence for claims, and include fact checks in our reporting, because truth matters, and the truth here is unambiguous. Gender-affirming care saves lives, and the people trying to ban it are doing so not out of concern for children, but out of ideological commitment to enforcing rigid gender norms and eliminating gender diversity from public life. This is a fight we can win, but only if we actually fight, only if we refuse to be reasonable or civil or moderate in the face of eliminationist politics. Only if we recognize that incremental progress and relying on institutional mechanisms has gotten us to a place where 27 states have banned gender-affirming care, affecting 120,400 trans youth, and the federal government is proposing rules that would make care inaccessible nationwide. The time for tepid centrism has passed. The time for trusting that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice on its own has passed. We are in a moment that demands fierce advocacy and radical solidarity, and absolute refusal to accept transgender people being legislated out of existence. Glenn Grothman and Marjorie Taylor Greene and the entire Republican Party have declared war on transgender people, particularly transgender children who are the most vulnerable and least able to defend themselves, and they're doing it with lies about social contagion and manufactured epidemics, and kids being pushed into transitions, and we have the truth and the evidence and the moral authority on our side, but that means nothing unless we organize and mobilize and fight with everything we have, because right now in this moment the lives and futures of hundreds of thousands of young people depend on whether we're willing to stand up and say no, you cannot do this. You will not erase transgender people. You will not criminalize healthcare. You will not sacrifice vulnerable children to score political points, and we will not stop fighting until every transgender person in this country has access to affirming care and the freedom to live authentically without fear of persecution or violence or legislative erasure.